heartbroken widow boards a random bus with no destination and sits beside a silent man who turns out to be a powerful CEO secretly searching for a real family. But before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Now, subscribe to the channel and let's get started. The early morning rain tapped gently against the bus stop shelter as Margaret Walsh pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. 48 years old, with auburn hair streaked prematurely with silver, she stood motionless, watching buses arrive and depart without making any move to board them. She wasn't waiting for any bus in particular. In fact, she wasn't waiting for anything at all. Today, Margaret simply needed to be away from the empty house, away from the sympathy casseroles still stacked in her freezer, and away from the deafening silence that had enveloped her life since Robert's death 3 months ago. A bus with no familiar number pulled up to the curb, its doors hissing open like an invitation. Without checking the destination, Margaret climbed aboard, paid her fare, and moved down the aisle. The bus was half empty, with plenty of vacant seats, yet something drew her toward the back, where a man sat alone, staring out the window. He wore an expensive-looking charcoal suit that seemed at odds with public transportation, his profile sharp against the rain-streaked glass. Without thinking too much about it, Margaret slid into the empty seat beside him, though dozens of others were available. The man briefly glanced her way, just long enough for Margaret to notice eyes the color of weathered steel, before returning his gaze to the window. Margaret didn't mind his silence. In fact, she preferred it. Conversation was the last thing she wanted, especially the kind that inevitably circled back to questions about how she was holding up or offers of help she didn't know how to accept. The bus lurched forward, carrying them deeper into parts of the city Margaret barely recognized. That was fine with her. Direction and destination had ceased to matter the moment the doctor had looked at her with that particular expression, "Doctor's perfect," for delivering the worst possible news. Terminal. 6 months. So sorry. Robert had managed only 4. "You don't have a destination in mind, do you?" The man beside her spoke suddenly, his voice deep and quiet, startling her from her thoughts. Margaret turned, surprised both by the accuracy of his observation and the fact that he'd broken his silence. "Excuse me?" "You didn't check the route before boarding," he said, still looking out the window. "You didn't even glance at the sign. You're just riding." Margaret stiffened. "I don't see how that's any of your business." The man finally turned to face her fully. His face was handsome in a severe way, with lines that spoke of stress rather than laughter. "It isn't," he conceded. "Merely an observation. I'm doing the same thing." This caught Margaret off guard. The man didn't look like someone who would aimlessly ride buses. Everything about him, from his perfectly tailored suit to his polished leather shoes, suggested purpose and direction. "You don't look like you're just riding," Margaret said before she could stop herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And what does someone who's just riding look like?" Like me, Margaret thought. Hollow-eyed, lost, wearing yesterday's clothes because it didn't matter anymore. "Not like you," she said finally. The bus hit a pothole, jolting them both. Margaret's worn leather purse slipped from her lap, spilling its contents across the floor. Embarrassed, she quickly bent to gather her scattered belongings. A wallet, keys, tissues, and a folded obituary that had been in her purse since the funeral. The man leaned down to help, picking up a small orange prescription bottle that had rolled near his feet. He handed it back without comment, but Margaret saw his eyes take in the label. Lorazepam. For anxiety. Prescribed after Robert's diagnosis when panic attacks had begun to wake her in the middle of the night, her heart pounding with the certainty that she couldn't do this, couldn't watch her husband disappear by degrees, couldn't be strong enough. "Thank you," she murmured, quickly tucking everything back into her purse. The obituary had partially unfolded, Robert's solemn face looking up at her from the grainy newsprint. She refolded it with practiced movements and buried it beneath her wallet. "I'm Alexander Reed," the man said unexpectedly, as if offering his name as a distraction from her embarrassment. Margaret hesitated, then replied, "Margaret Walsh." "Where are you not going today, Margaret Walsh?" Alexander asked, and there was something in his tone, not quite humor but a recognition of the absurdity of their shared non-destination, that made her answer honestly. "Anywhere but home." Alexander nodded. "That makes two of us." They fell back into silence as the bus continued its journey through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Rain continued to streak the windows, transforming the world outside into an impressionist painting of blurred colors and indistinct shapes. Margaret found herself stealing glances at her silent companion, wondering what could drive a man who looked like he belonged in the back of a chauffeured car to ride a city bus to nowhere. After 20 minutes, the bus pulled up to a stop in what appeared to be a small business district. "This is my stop," Alexander said, suddenly standing. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "There's a cafe across the street that makes decent coffee. Would you like to join me?" Margaret stared at him, baffled by the invitation. "I thought you were just riding." "I was," he said, "but now I'm thinking about coffee." Margaret should have said no. She'd come out today specifically to be alone, away from people and their well-intentioned concern. Yet something about Alexander Reed intrigued her, perhaps the fact that he seemed as determined to avoid his destination as she was. "All right," she found herself saying. "Coffee." The cafe was small and warm, with mismatched furniture and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. They claimed a table by the window, watching the rain create puddles on the sidewalk outside. Margaret ordered a simple black coffee while Alexander chose some complicated espresso drink that made her raise an eyebrow. "What?" he asked, catching her expression. "Nothing," she said. "It's just very specific." "I know what I like," he replied. And for a moment, Margaret thought she detected a hint of defensiveness in his tone. Their drinks arrived, and Margaret wrapped her cold hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. She hadn't realized how chilled she'd become, sitting on that bus, lost in memories. "So," Alexander said after taking a sip of his elaborate coffee, "what are you avoiding at home?" The directness of the question startled her. "Ghosts," she answered before she could censor herself. "And you? What's a man in a suit like that doing riding buses with no destination?" "Avoiding reality, I suppose," he said. "Sometimes even the most luxurious prison is still a prison." Margaret studied him over the rim of her mug. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" Alexander laughed, a sound with little humor in it. "Not the kind you're thinking of. I'm the CEO of Reed Enterprises. We develop commercial real estate, among other things." The name sounded vaguely familiar to Margaret. She might have seen it on construction signs around the city or mentioned in the business section of the newspaper that Robert used to read every Sunday morning. "That doesn't explain the bus," Margaret pointed out. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his dark hair, which was just beginning to silver at the temples. "No, it doesn't. Let's just say I needed some perspective. Our corporate headquarters is in the financial district. I was supposed to be there 3 hours ago for a board meeting. Instead, I've been riding public transit, trying to remember why any of it matters." "And does it?" Margaret asked. "Matter?" Their eyes met across the small table, and for a moment Margaret glimpsed something in Alexander's gaze, a loneliness that mirrored her own, though born of different circumstances. "That," he said quietly, "is precisely what I'm trying to figure out." Outside, the rain began to ease, thin sunlight breaking through the clouds and casting weak shadows on the cafe floor. Margaret checked her watch, surprised to find that nearly an hour had passed. Time had moved so strangely since Robert's death, sometimes crawling by in excruciating increments, other times disappearing in chunks she couldn't account for. "I should go," she said, though she had nowhere to be. Alexander nodded, but made no move to leave. "Where will you go now?" Margaret considered the question. Her empty house waited, filled with 17 years of marriage and the echoing silence of its abrupt end. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I'll get back on the bus." "May I make a suggestion?" Alexander asked, and continued when Margaret nodded cautiously. "There's a botanical garden about 2 stops from here. The conservatory is warm and dry, and at this time of year not many people visit." He hesitated, then added, "I go there sometimes when I need to think." Margaret found herself intrigued by the image of this polished executive wandering among tropical plants, avoiding board meetings and seeking solitude. "Thank you," she said. "I might do that." They left the cafe together, standing awkwardly on the sidewalk as the city continued to bustle around them. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and produced a business card which he handed to Margaret. "If you ever find yourself wanting company on your non-journeys," he said, "my mobile number is on there." Margaret accepted the card, slipping it into her coat pocket without looking at it. "Thank you for the coffee, Mr. Reed." "Alexander," he corrected. "Alexander," she echoed, and for the first time that day, perhaps for the first time in months, Margaret felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief or numbness. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but maybe a distant cousin to curiosity. "Goodbye." As she walked toward the bus stop, Margaret sensed him watching her go. She didn't look back, but she could feel his presence like a warm spot in the cold air of the January afternoon. The weight of the business card in her pocket felt disproportionate to its actual size. She boarded the next bus, this time checking the route to confirm it would take her to the botanical gardens. As the bus pulled away from the curb, Margaret caught a glimpse of Alexander still standing outside the cafe, his tall figure motionless amid the flowing crowd. Then the bus turned a corner, and he was gone. The botanical garden was exactly as Alexander had described, warm, humid, and blissfully empty. Margaret wandered the winding paths, past tropical flowers in vibrant colors and small placards identifying specimens she'd never heard of. The air smelled of damp earth and growing things, a welcome change from the antiseptic scent that had permeated her home during Robert's final weeks. She found a bench near a small indoor waterfall and sat down, listening to the gentle splash of water against stone. For the first time since the funeral, Margaret allowed her mind to drift without immediately steering it away from painful memories. She thought of Robert, not as he'd been at the end, thin and jaundiced, but as he'd been in the beginning. His booming laugh, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how he'd always insisted on driving, even on long road trips, claiming Margaret's driving made him nervous. Tears came, as they always did, but here in this verdant sanctuary, they felt less raw, less like an open wound, and more like the necessary rain that helps things grow. She wasn't sure how long she sat there, lost in memories, before she became aware of a presence beside her. Looking up, she was startled to find Alexander Reed lowering himself onto the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I didn't follow you, This is where I usually come." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "It's fine. It's a public garden." Alexander looked uncomfortable, like a man unused to finding himself in awkward situations. "I can leave if you'd prefer to be alone." Margaret considered this. Part of her did want solitude, but another part, a part that had been silent since Robert's diagnosis, was curious about this man who rode buses to nowhere and sought refuge among exotic plants. "You can stay," she said finally. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching water cascade over artfully arranged stones. The white noise created a bubble of privacy in the already quiet conservatory. "Were you married long?" Alexander asked eventually. Margaret looked at him sharply. "What makes you think I was married?" He gestured vaguely toward her hand, and Margaret realized she was still twisting her wedding ring, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past few months. "Oh," she said, 17 years. "I'm sorry for your loss." The standard phrase, one Margaret had heard countless times, but from Alexander it sounded different. There was no reflexive sympathy in his voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of fact. "Thank you," she said. "It's been 3 months." Alexander nodded. "Recently, then?" "Yes." Margaret watched a droplet of water travel down a broad leaf, gathering weight until it fell. "What about you? Are you married?" "No," he replied. "Never have been." "Divorced?" "Not even that." Alexander shifted slightly, recrossing his legs. "My work has always been consuming." "Reed Enterprises," Margaret remembered. "Real estate development." "Among other things," he confirmed. "We have divisions in technology, renewable energy, and international finance. The company was my father's initially. I took over when he retired 15 years ago." "That sounds impressive," Margaret said, though what she really thought was that it sounded lonely. Alexander shrugged, the gesture at odds with his formal appearance. "It's just work." "Important enough work to make you feel guilty for skipping a board meeting," Margaret pointed out. This earned her a surprised look, followed by a rueful smile. "Touché, Mrs. Walsh." "Margaret," she corrected. "Margaret," he echoed, in much the same way she had repeated his name earlier. "Yes, I suppose there is a certain weight of responsibility. The company employs over 5,000 people globally. Their livelihoods depend on decisions I make." Margaret considered this. "That doesn't explain why you were riding a bus this morning instead of making those decisions." Alexander was silent for so long that Margaret began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost confessional. "My father died 6 months ago." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, the words automatic. Alexander shook his head slightly. "We weren't close. In fact, our relationship was largely professional for the past decade or so, but his death has made me reevaluate certain things." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. "He built the company from nothing," Alexander continued. "It consumed him. As a child, I rarely saw him. When I did, it was usually at company events where I was trotted out as the heir apparent, then promptly sent back to boarding school." He paused. "I swore I'd be different when I took over, but somehow—" "You became him," Margaret finished. Alexander's eyes met hers, and Margaret saw in them a recognition that startled her. "Yes," he said simply. "And now I wonder if I've made the same mistakes. I'm 45 years old. I have no wife, no children, no real connections outside of the business world. My father at least had my mother, though their relationship was hardly what you'd call warm. I don't even have that. Is that why you were riding the bus? Looking for connections?" Alexander laughed softly. "No, that was just, I don't know, an impulse. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage, and I suddenly couldn't bear the thought of walking into that boardroom again, listening to quarterly projections and development timelines, so I just walked out, found a bus stop, started riding, and ended up sitting next to me," Margaret said. "And ended up sitting next to you," he agreed. "Out of all the empty seats on that bus." The implication hung in the air between them. Out of all the empty seats, she had chosen to sit beside him. Out of all the empty seats, he had been sitting exactly where she felt drawn to sit. Margaret looked away, unsettled by the intensity of his gaze. "Coincidence," she said firmly. "Of course," Alexander agreed too quickly. They lapsed into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with something Margaret couldn't quite name. Not attraction exactly, though Alexander was undeniably handsome in a severe way. It was more like recognition, the sense of finding someone who understood a language you'd been speaking alone. "Tell me about your husband," Alexander said suddenly. Margaret tensed. People usually avoided the subject, afraid to upset her or unsure what to say. "What do you want to know?" "Anything," What did he do? What made you fall in love with him? What would he think about you riding buses to nowhere with strange men? Despite herself, Margaret smiled at the last question. He'd probably think I've lost my mind. Have you? The directness of the question made her laugh, a rusty sound she barely recognized as her own. Maybe a little, she admitted. Robert was a high school English teacher. We met at a bookstore. He was looking for a specific edition of Steinbeck, and I happened to know where it was shelved. Let me guess, Alexander said. You worked there? No, I was just a frequent customer with an excellent memory for inventory. Margaret smiled at the recollection. He asked me to coffee to thank me. We were married 8 months later. That's fast. When you know, Margaret said, echoing words Robert had often repeated when telling their story. He was kind, steady, the sort of man who remembered birthdays and anniversaries without being reminded, who brought me tea in bed every Sunday morning for 17 years without fail. Her voice caught. Even when he was sick, he tried to keep up the tradition. I'd find him in the kitchen, shaking so badly he'd spilled half the tea, insisting he was fine. Alexander was watching her intently. You miss him? Every minute, Margaret confirmed. But it's more than that. I don't know who I am without him. We were so intertwined for so long. Now it's like I'm missing a limb, but I'm still feeling phantom pains. Alexander nodded slowly. I can't imagine what that's like, he said, to be that connected to someone. You've never been in love? Margaret asked, surprised. Alexander considered the question seriously. I've been infatuated. I've been in relationships that were convenient or strategically advantageous. But love, he shook his head. I don't think so. That sounds clinical. It was, he agreed without defensiveness. Most of my life has been carefully planned, strategically executed, emotionally contained. And now, Alexander looked around the conservatory, at the riotous growth surrounding them, vines climbing trellises, flowers bursting with color, leaves unfurling toward the light. Now I'm wondering what I've missed. A chime sounded, indicating the gardens would be closing soon. Margaret stood, suddenly aware of how long they'd been talking. The afternoon had slipped away, the light outside the glass walls of the conservatory fading to dusk. I should go, she said, gathering her purse. Thank you for telling me about this place. It was peaceful. Alexander rose as well, towering over her slight frame. May I walk you out? Margaret nodded, and they made their way back through the winding paths, retracing the route she'd taken earlier. Outside, the evening had turned cold, the earlier rain leaving a damp chill in the air. Do you have far to go? Alexander asked as they stood on the sidewalk. Not too far, Margaret said vaguely, suddenly uncomfortable with the idea of sharing her address with a man she'd just met, no matter how non-threatening he seemed. Alexander seemed to sense her hesitation. Let me call you a car, at least. That's not necessary. Please, he insisted, it's getting dark, and it's the least I can do after interrupting your solitude. Before Margaret could protest further, Alexander had taken out his phone and tapped a few commands. It will be here in 2 minutes, he said, putting the phone away. The fare is already covered. Thank you, Margaret said, feeling oddly formal after the intimacy of their earlier conversation. That's very kind. Alexander looked as if he wanted to say something more, but instead he simply nodded. It was unexpected, meeting you today, Margaret Walsh. Likewise, Alexander Reed. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb and the driver lowered the window. Ride for Walsh? Margaret turned to Alexander one last time. Goodbye. Until next time, he replied, and there was something in his voice, a certainty perhaps, or a hope, that made Margaret pause. What makes you think there will be a next time? She asked. Alexander smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere features. "Just a feeling," he said. "Besides, you still have my card." As the car pulled away, Margaret found herself looking back through the rear window. Alexander stood on the sidewalk, watching her go, much as he had after their coffee. This time, though, instead of feeling like a strange encounter with a stranger, it felt like the beginning of something. What exactly, Margaret wasn't sure, but for the first time in 3 months, she was curious to find out. The car dropped Margaret at her address, a modest 2-story colonial in a quiet suburb that seemed a world away from the bustling downtown area where she'd spent the day. Standing on the sidewalk, she stared at her darkened house, suddenly reluctant to go inside. During Robert's illness, the house had transformed from a home into something like a private hospital, with medical equipment, prescription bottles, and the constant stream of visiting nurses. After his death, Margaret had methodically packed away the medical trappings, but she hadn't quite managed to reclaim the space as her own. She climbed the 3 steps to the front porch, fumbling with her keys in the dim porch light. Once inside, she moved through the familiar ritual, dropping her keys in the ceramic dish Robert had made in a pottery class years ago, hanging her coat on the hook by the door, slipping off her shoes. The house was silent except for the soft tick of the grandfather clock in the living room and the low hum of the refrigerator. Margaret switched on lamps as she moved through the house, dispelling shadows, but not the emptiness. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator and stared at its meager contents, realizing she hadn't gone grocery shopping in over a week. She wasn't hungry anyway. Food had become merely functional since Robert's death, something she consumed to keep going without enjoyment or interest. As she put the kettle on for tea, Margaret found herself replaying moments from the day. The rain-streaked bus window, Alexander's weathered steel eyes, the warmth and humidity of the botanical garden. It had been the first day in months where grief hadn't been her constant companion, lurking just behind every thought. Instead, she'd felt present, engaged, curious about the enigmatic man who'd chosen to share his afternoon with her. Margaret's coat hung by the door, and she could see the edge of Alexander's business card peeking from the pocket. After making her tea, she retrieved it, studying the heavy cream cardstock with its embossed lettering. Alexander Reed, Chief Executive Officer, Reed Enterprises. Below his title was a phone number. Not an office line, Margaret suspected, but his personal mobile, given specifically to her. She set the card on the kitchen table, where it seemed to take up more space than its dimensions warranted. Margaret sipped her tea, considering what she'd learned about Alexander. A successful CEO who'd never married, never really connected with anyone. A man who'd lost his father recently and found himself questioning his life choices. There was a vulnerability beneath his polished exterior that had surprised her, and perhaps him as well. Margaret couldn't remember the last time she'd felt curious about another person. Before Robert's illness, she'd had friends, colleagues at the library where she worked part-time, a book club that met monthly. But as Robert grew sicker, her world had narrowed to the dimensions of their home, to doctor's appointments and medication schedules. After his death, she hadn't had the energy to reconnect with the outside world, yet today she'd felt something stir, a faint echo of the person she used to be, the woman who'd approached a stranger in a bookstore to help him find a rare edition of Steinbeck, the woman who'd said yes to coffee with a handsome English teacher, the woman who'd once been capable of taking chances. Margaret picked up the business card again, running her thumb over the embossed lettering. What would it mean to contact him? Not romance, she wasn't ready for that, might never be, but friendship, companionship, the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who seemed to understand the particular contours of loss. Before she could talk herself out of it, Margaret reached for her phone. Across town, in a penthouse office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Alexander Reed was working late, or at least attempting to work. He'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes, unable to focus on quarterly projections and profit margins. Instead, his mind kept wandering to a botanical garden and a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair. The knock on his door was a welcome interruption. "Come in," he called, closing the spreadsheet with relief. His executive assistant, Helen, entered, carrying a stack of files. In her 60s, with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, Helen had been with the company since Alexander's father's time and was one of the few people who spoke to him without deference or fear. "You missed 6 meetings today," she said without preamble, depositing the files on his desk. "The board is not pleased. Thomas Kirkwood has called 3 times demanding an explanation." "Tell Thomas he's welcome to take it up with me directly," Alexander replied, leaning back in his chair. Helen arched an eyebrow. "I've been fielding calls for you all day, Alexander. The least you could do is tell me what's going on." Alexander sighed, gesturing for Helen to sit. She did, folding her hands in her lap and fixing him with a penetrating gaze. "I needed a break," he said finally. "I got in my car this morning, drove to the garage, and couldn't bring myself to come upstairs." "So you just didn't," Helen said, her tone suggesting this was both unprecedented and alarming. "Where did you go instead?" Alexander hesitated, then admitted, "I rode the city bus." Both of Helen's eyebrows shot up now. "You rode the bus," she repeated. "You, Alexander Reed, who has a driver on call 24/7, decided to ride public transportation. For fun." "Not for fun, exactly. Just, I needed to be somewhere different. Somewhere I wasn't Alexander Reed, CEO. Helen's expression softened slightly. "This is about your father, isn't it?" Alexander should have known Helen would understand. She'd worked with his father for decades, had witnessed firsthand the complicated dynamics of their relationship. "Partly," he acknowledged. "Dad spent his whole life building this company. And what did it get him? A corner office, a heart attack at 65, and a son he barely knew." "Your father was proud of you," Helen said gently. "No, he was proud of what I accomplished for the company," Alexander corrected. "There's a difference." Helen didn't argue, which was answer enough. After a moment she asked, "So you rode the bus? Then what?" Alexander felt a reluctance to share the details of his day with Margaret, though he couldn't quite articulate why. It had been an encounter both mundane and extraordinary, an afternoon of conversation with a grieving widow that had somehow left him more unsettled than any high-stakes business negotiation. "I went to the botanical garden," he said, offering a partial truth. "Spent some time thinking." Helen studied him for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but after 30 years as an executive assistant, she knew when not to push. "Well, whatever you were thinking about, I hope it was worth alienating the entire board," she said, rising from her chair. "You might want to make an appearance at tomorrow's strategy meeting at least." "I'll be there," Alexander promised. After Helen left, Alexander turned to the windows, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the darkness. Somewhere out there was Margaret Walsh, back in her empty house, carrying her grief like a familiar weight. Had their paths crossed by pure chance, or was there some meaning to be found in their meeting? Alexander had never been prone to philosophical musings, preferring the concrete realities of business to abstract questions. But today had shaken something loose in him. His phone buzzed on the desk, displaying a number he didn't recognize. Alexander picked it up, expecting a business call despite the late hour. "Alexander Reed," he answered. There was a brief silence on the other end, then a voice he immediately recognized. "It's Margaret Walsh, from the bus." Something in Alexander's chest expanded at the sound of her voice. "Margaret," he said, unable to keep the pleasure from his tone. "I didn't expect to hear from you so soon." "Neither did I," she admitted. "But I've been sitting in my kitchen staring at your business card for the past hour, and I thought, well, I'm not entirely sure what I thought." Alexander smiled, leaning back in his chair. I'm glad you called, regardless of the reason." Another silence, this one less awkward. "I realized I never thanked you properly for the ride home," Margaret said finally. "It was the least I could do," Alexander replied. "Did you make it back all right?" "Yes, fine." Margaret paused. "I was thinking about what you said at the garden, about wondering what you've missed." "I meant it," Alexander said, swiveling his chair away from the city lights to focus entirely on her voice. "Today was the first time I can't remember how long that I've had a conversation that wasn't about business." "That's sad," Margaret said plainly. Alexander laughed, surprised by her candor. "Yes, I suppose it is. I was wondering—" Margaret's voice trailed off, and Alexander could almost see her twisting her wedding ring, as she had in the garden. "There's an exhibition at the City Museum, photographs of national parks. Robert and I had planned to go before he got sick. I have tickets for Saturday and I was thinking of going, but I'm not sure I can face it alone." The invitation hung in the air between them, tentative and vulnerable. "I'd be honored to accompany you," Alexander said, keeping his voice as steady as possible, not wanting to betray how moved he was by her reaching out. "What time shall I pick you up?" They arranged the details, and then there was another pause, this one comfortable, like the silence they'd shared in the garden. "Thank you," Margaret said finally. "For today. It was nice to remember what it feels like to just talk to someone." "I feel the same way," Alexander admitted. "More than you know." After they hung up, Alexander remained at his desk, looking at his phone as if it might explain the strange turn his day had taken. When he'd walked out of the parking garage that morning, he'd had no destination in mind, no plan beyond escape. Now, he found himself with plans for Saturday that had nothing to do with Reed Enterprises and everything to do with a silver-haired widow who had somehow seen through his carefully constructed facade. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Alexander felt something like anticipation. Margaret set her phone down on the kitchen table, her heart beating faster than normal. Had she really just invited a man she barely knew to accompany her to the photography exhibition? The tickets had been purchased months ago, part of Robert's determined effort to maintain normalcy in the face of his diagnosis. "We need things to look forward to," he'd insisted, even as they'd both known he'd likely never make it to the exhibition. Now, Margaret had repurposed those tickets, turning what would have been a painfully solitary experience into something new. Not a date. She wasn't ready for that, might never be. But a step back toward the world of the living, guided by someone who seemed to understand the language of loss. As she prepared for bed that night, moving through the quiet house with its echoes of Robert, Margaret found herself wondering what he would think about her day, about Alexander. She could almost hear his voice. "You sat next to a complete stranger on a bus? That doesn't sound like my cautious Margaret." "It wasn't about caution," she murmured to the empty room, answering the ghost of her husband. "It was about connection." For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret fell asleep without needing to take the anxiety medication that had become her nightly ritual. Instead, she drifted off with thoughts of botanical gardens and weathered steel eyes, her dreams untethered from grief, if only temporarily. Saturday arrived with unexpected sunshine, casting golden light through Margaret's bedroom window. She stood before her closet, surveying clothes she hadn't worn in months. During Robert's illness, she'd lived in practical, comfortable attire, sweaters and jeans, the occasional pair of khakis for doctor's appointments. After his death, she'd continued the pattern, seeing no reason to dress for a world she barely participated in. Now, preparing to meet Alexander at the museum, Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. What did one wear to meet a CEO for a not date at a photography exhibition? She finally settled on a forest green dress with three-quarter sleeves, conservative but not matronly, elegant without being formal. It had been a gift from Robert on their 15th anniversary, and wearing it felt both right and vaguely disloyal. As she applied a light touch of makeup, another practice she'd abandoned during Robert's illness, Margaret had a sudden, vivid memory of her husband sitting on the edge of the bathtub, watching her get ready for a faculty dinner at his school. "You're beautiful," he'd said, his voice warm with affection. "The most beautiful woman in any room." "You're biased," she'd replied, smiling at him in the mirror. "Completely," he'd agreed without hesitation, "and grateful for it every day." Margaret set down her mascara, tears threatening to ruin her careful application. "I miss you," she whispered to the empty bathroom. "I don't know what I'm doing." But she did know, in a way. She was trying to live again, to find her way back to the world Robert had left. Wasn't that what he would have wanted? She finished her makeup, slipped on sensible black heels, and checked her reflection one last time. The woman who stared back at her looked familiar but somehow changed, as if grief had altered not just her interior landscape but her physical features as well. There were new lines around her eyes, a certain guardedness in her expression that hadn't been there before. But she was presentable at least, ready to step outside the bubble of mourning if only for an afternoon. Alexander had offered to pick her up, but Margaret had declined, preferring to meet him at the museum. It felt safer somehow, maintaining that small boundary. She arrived 15 minutes early and waited on the broad steps, watching Saturday crowds flow in and out of the imposing granite building. Across town, Alexander was experiencing his own pre-meeting anxiety, though of a different nature. He stood in his walk-in closet, larger than some people's apartments, surrounded by tailored suits in every shade of gray, navy, and black. For the first time, he found himself dissatisfied with the uniform of power and success he'd cultivated over the years. "Too formal," he muttered, discarding a charcoal suit. "Too corporate," he decided, bypassing a navy blazer with the Reed Enterprises logo subtly embroidered on the breast pocket. Alexander couldn't remember the last time he'd dressed for a purely social occasion. His calendar was filled with business dinners, charity galas where Reed Enterprises was a major donor, and industry functions where his attire was as much a statement of power as his presence. But today wasn't about Reed Enterprises. It was about Alexander Reed, the man. A distinction he was only beginning to recognize. He finally selected dark jeans and a casual button-down shirt in a deep burgundy, an ensemble he might have worn during his college years, before his father's expectations and his own ambition had narrowed his life to boardrooms and balance sheets. Looking in the mirror, Alexander barely recognized himself. Without the armor of his bespoke suits, he looked younger, less intimidating, perhaps even approachable. As he drove to the museum, having dismissed his usual driver for the day, Alexander found himself unexpectedly nervous. This wasn't a business negotiation or a board presentation, scenarios where his confidence was unshakable. This was something new, spending time with a woman who had no connection to his professional life, who saw him not as Alexander Reed, CEO, but simply as Alexander, the man she'd met on a bus. Alexander arrived at the museum precisely on time and spotted Margaret immediately. She stood on the steps, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, wearing a green dress that seemed to intensify the color of her eyes. For a moment, he simply watched her, struck by how solitary she appeared in the midst of the bustling crowd, a woman encased in a bubble of her own making, separate from the flow of life around her. When she saw him, something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but an easing of tension. Alexander climbed the steps to meet her, suddenly conscious of his casual attire. "I almost didn't recognize you without the suit," Margaret said by way of greeting. Alexander smiled, relieved by her candor. "I wasn't sure if this was appropriate. I don't do casual very often." "It suits you," Margaret replied, then seemed embarrassed by the inadvertent wordplay. "I mean, you look nice, less intimidating." "I intimidated you before?" Alexander asked as they turned to enter the museum. Margaret considered this as they walked through the grand entrance hall. Not intimidated exactly, but you did project a certain inaccessibility, like someone accustomed to keeping others at a distance. Her perception startled him with its accuracy. And now? Margaret glanced up at him. Now you look like someone I might have met under normal circumstances. Someone who could have been a friend of Robert's. The mention of her husband's name hung in the air between them, not awkwardly, but as a gentle reminder of the boundaries of whatever this was developing between them. Alexander nodded, accepting this framing of their outing. Friends. It was a role he had little experience with, having long ago allowed acquaintances and colleagues to stand in for genuine connection. They moved through the museum to the special exhibition gallery where America's Wild Spaces was being showcased. The photographs were stunning, vast landscapes captured in extraordinary detail, from the red rock formations of Utah to the misty coastlines of the Pacific Northwest. Each image was accompanied by a small plaque with information about the location and the photographer's technique. Robert loved photography, Margaret said as they paused before a particularly striking image of a lightning storm over the Grand Canyon. Amateur stuff, nothing like this, but he had a good eye. Did you travel much together? Alexander asked. Margaret nodded. Every summer, Robert had those long teacher breaks and I could usually arrange time off from the library. We made it to 16 national parks over the years. Which was your favorite? Acadia, Margaret replied without hesitation. In Maine. There's something about the way the forest meets the sea, these ancient trees standing guard over the Atlantic. Robert proposed to me there, actually, on top of Cadillac Mountain at sunrise. Alexander tried to imagine it, a younger Margaret and the man she'd loved, standing on a mountaintop as dawn broke over the ocean. It was a scene from a life so different from his own that it might as well have been fiction. What about you? Margaret asked. Do you travel for pleasure or is it all business? Alexander considered the question. Almost entirely business, he admitted, though I'm not sure I would recognize pleasure travel if I experienced it. My father believed vacations were for people who lacked ambition. And you adopted his philosophy? I never questioned it, Alexander said, the realization striking him as they moved to the next photograph. Work was always the priority, the only priority, really. That sounds terribly lonely, Margaret said, her eyes on a photograph of a solitary tree standing against the vast expanse of the Badlands. It was, Alexander agreed, the simple admission feeling like a confession. It is. They continued through the exhibition in companionable silence, pausing before images that particularly spoke to them. Alexander found himself drawn to the more desolate landscapes, the stark beauty of Death Valley, the otherworldly rock formations of the Painted Desert. Margaret lingered over scenes of lush forests and mountain lakes, places of life and renewal. What changed? Margaret asked as they stood before a panoramic view of Yellowstone. You said you never questioned your father's philosophy, but clearly something has shifted. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here with me instead of working on a Saturday. Alexander considered the question carefully. Several things, I suppose. My father's death, certainly. Seeing the culmination of a life dedicated almost exclusively to work. There was a memorial service, hundreds of people from the business world, politicians, celebrities, all there to honor his achievements. But, Margaret prompted when he paused, but afterward, at the wake, I overheard two of his oldest colleagues talking. One asked the other what my father had been like as a person, and the other just laughed and said, "Who knows? I worked with him for 30 years and never saw behind the mask." Alexander shook his head at the memory. It bothered me more than I expected. The idea that someone could live a whole life, achieve so much, and still remain essentially unknown. Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. And you began to wonder if you were on the same path. Exactly, Alexander said, surprised and gratified by her intuition. It's been 6 months of, I don't know what to call it, not quite a crisis. More like a slow awakening to the possibility that I've been measuring success by the wrong metrics. They had reached the end of the exhibition, a wall-sized photograph of a night sky over the Tetons, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet darkness. "Robert and I camped there," Margaret said, her voice soft with memory. "We laid in our sleeping bags outside the tent and watched the stars all night. He knew the constellations, could tell me the stories behind each one. I remember thinking that I'd never felt so small and yet so connected to something immense." Alexander studied her profile, struck by the blend of grief and gratitude in her expression. "You were lucky to have that," he said. "To have him." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Yes," she agreed. "I was, but that doesn't make the after any easier." They stood there for a long moment, surrounded by images of America's wild, beautiful emptiness. Two people who had experienced loss in very different ways finding unexpected common ground. "Are you hungry?" Alexander asked finally. "There's a cafe here in the museum, or we could go somewhere else if you prefer." Margaret seemed to consider the question more deeply than it warranted, as if weighing not just her appetite but her readiness to extend their time together. "The cafe would be nice," she said at last. "I'd like to talk more about these other metrics of success you mentioned." As they made their way to the museum cafe, Alexander found himself experiencing an unfamiliar feeling, not the satisfaction of closing a deal or the triumph of outmaneuvering a competitor, but something quieter and more profound. It was the simple pleasure of being known, even if just a little, by someone with no agenda beyond genuine connection. They found a small table in the corner of the cafe, away from the bustling main area. Over soup and sandwiches, their conversation continued, moving from national parks to books, Margaret's passion, to architecture, a personal interest of Alexander's that had nothing to do with his company's real estate developments. "You're different than I expected," Margaret said as they lingered over coffee. "How so?" "You're more human," she said after a moment's consideration. "When I first saw you on the bus, I thought you were just another corporate automaton having some kind of midlife crisis." Alexander laughed, surprising himself with the genuine sound. "That's not entirely inaccurate." "No, but it's incomplete," Margaret said, studying him with those perceptive eyes that seemed to see beyond his careful self-presentation. "There's more to you than the CEO." "I'm beginning to hope so," Alexander said quietly. "With your help." Margaret looked startled. "My help?" "You see things," Alexander explained. "In me, in the photographs back there, you have a way of looking beneath the surface that I find refreshing." A delicate blush colored Margaret's cheeks. "Robert used to say I'd have made a good detective. I notice details." "What details do you notice about me?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious. Margaret took a sip of her coffee, considering him over the rim of the cup. "You have a scar on your right hand just below the thumb. You check your watch exactly every 20 minutes, but I don't think you're actually registering the time. When you're truly engaged in conversation, you lean forward slightly, and your eyes focus completely on the speaker. And despite your obvious wealth and power, you listened to the museum docent's explanation of photography techniques with genuine interest, even though I suspect you already knew most of what she was saying." Alexander stared at her, both disconcerted and impressed by her observations. "That's remarkably accurate." "Details," Margaret said with a small shrug. "They matter." As they prepared to leave the museum, Alexander found himself reluctant to end their afternoon. "Would you like to walk for a bit?" he suggested. "There's a park just across the street." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." Outside, the afternoon sunlight had taken on the golden quality of early evening, casting long shadows across the museum steps. As they crossed toward the park, Alexander felt an impulse he couldn't quite explain. Without overthinking it, he offered Margaret his arm, an old-fashioned gesture that seemed appropriate to the momentary formality between them. After a brief hesitation, Margaret slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, and together they stepped away from the architectural grandeur of the museum and into the simple beauty of the park beyond, where pathways wound through autumn-touched trees and the world seemed full of unexpected possibilities. The park was alive with weekend activity. Children racing across grassy expanses, couples lounging on blankets, an elderly man throwing bread to aggressive pigeons despite prominent signs prohibiting the practice. Margaret and Alexander walked slowly along a winding path, her hand still resting lightly in the crook of his arm. "Tell me about the library," Alexander said as they passed a small pond where toy sailboats skimmed across the surface, guided by children with remote controls. "You mentioned working there part-time?" Margaret nodded. "I'm the Special Collections librarian. Or I was. I've been on extended leave since Robert got sick." "What does a Special Collections librarian do, exactly?" "We preserve and manage rare books, manuscripts, historical documents, items too valuable or fragile for general circulation." Margaret's face brightened as she spoke, her professional passion evident. "My focus is on early 20th century women's literature. We have some remarkable first editions, correspondence between authors, original manuscripts with handwritten edits." "You enjoy it," Alexander observed. "I love it," Margaret corrected. "Or loved it. I'm not sure if I'm ready to go back." She paused, then admitted, "The thought of returning to normal life, whatever that means now, is both appealing and terrifying." "How so?" They found an empty bench overlooking the pond and sat down, Margaret releasing her hold on Alexander's arm. She seemed to consider his question carefully. "Going back would mean accepting that life continues without Robert," she explained. "That the world keeps turning despite this enormous absence. Part of me wants to move forward, to find a new normal. But another part feels like that would be a betrayal, as if by adapting to his absence I'm somehow erasing him." Alexander nodded, understanding more than she might have expected. "After my father died, I threw myself into work. 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I told myself it was to stabilize the company during the transition. But really, I think I was afraid to slow down long enough to feel anything." "And now?" Margaret asked, turning to study his profile. Alexander watched a child's sailboat capsize in a sudden breeze, its young captain wailing in distress until a parent waded in to rescue the toy. "Now I'm trying to understand what I've been running from all these years. My father's death just brought it into sharper focus." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, watching the activity around the pond. A street musician had set up nearby, saxophone notes drifting on the autumn air, adding a melancholy soundtrack to the scene. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," Margaret said suddenly. Alexander turned to look at her, surprised. "Oh?" "When I said I was on extended leave. That's not exactly accurate." Margaret twisted her wedding ring, a nervous habit Alexander had already noticed. "I resigned 2 months ago, after Robert died." "May I ask why?" Margaret sighed. "The library offered to hold my position, to give me all the time I needed. They were incredibly supportive. But I couldn't imagine going back to that life, the routine, the colleagues who knew me as half of a whole. I thought a clean break would be easier." "And was it?" "No," Margaret admitted with a sad smile. "It just meant I had more empty hours to fill, more silence in the house, more time to realize I have no idea who I am without him." Alexander considered this. "What did you do before you met Robert?" The question seemed to surprise Margaret. "I was finishing my master's in library science, working on a thesis about women's domestic fiction of the 1920s. I had a small apartment full of books and a cat named Fitzgerald." "What happened to Fitzgerald?" A genuine laugh escaped Margaret, the sound bright against the backdrop of the park. "He lived a long, spoiled life and died peacefully at 17, if you can believe it. Robert was allergic, but he took allergy medication every day rather than ask me to give up my cat." Alexander smiled. imagining the kind of man who would make such a sacrifice for love. He sounds remarkable. He was ordinary in the most extraordinary ways, Margaret said, her voice warm with memory. He coached Little League even though we didn't have children. He remembered the birthdays of every colleague at his school. He saved spiders instead of killing them, carefully transporting them outside in cups covered with paper. "And he loved you," Alexander said quietly. "Yes," Margaret agreed, "and I loved him. Still do." She looked at Alexander directly, her green eyes clear and honest. "I need you to understand that. I'm not looking to replace him. I don't think I could, even if I wanted to." "I understand," Alexander assured her, touched by her candor. I'm not expecting—" "I know," Margaret said, saving him from his uncharacteristic verbal fumbling. "Neither am I. I just needed to be clear about where I am." Alexander nodded, relieved by her directness. "I appreciate that. And to be equally clear, I'm not exactly in a place for conventional relationships either. My life has been work for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be anything other than Alexander Reed, CEO." "Then perhaps," Margaret suggested, "we can simply be two people helping each other remember who we are beneath those other identities. Widow, CEO, just Margaret and Alexander, figuring things out." The simplicity of her proposal struck Alexander as both profound and exactly right. "I'd like that," he said. They resumed their walk, circling the pond and heading toward a more wooded area of the park where the paths were less crowded. Alexander found himself telling Margaret about his childhood, growing up in the shadow of Reed Enterprises, the pressure of being the founder's son, the boarding schools and Ivy League education that had been less choices than predetermined steps on a carefully plotted course. "Did you ever want to do something else?" Margaret asked as they passed beneath a canopy of maple trees, their leaves beginning to turn crimson and gold. "Something other than taking over the company?" Alexander had to think about it. "Architecture," he said finally. "I was fascinated by buildings as a child, how they were designed, how they functioned, how they made people feel when they entered them. I used to sketch skyscrapers in the margins of my school notebooks. And your father didn't encourage this interest? He saw it as a hobby at best, a distraction at worst." Alexander shrugged. "It wasn't rebellion exactly, more like a private indulgence. I still follow architectural journals, visit significant buildings when I travel, but it was never a serious consideration as a career." "That seems sad," Margaret said simply. "Does it?" Alexander had never really thought of it that way. It always just seemed inevitable. Reed Enterprises was my birthright, my responsibility. The architecture interest was like those national parks you visited, a beautiful place to visit, but not somewhere to live. They had reached a small clearing with a stone fountain at its center. The water had been turned off for the approaching winter, leaving the basin dry except for a scattering of copper-colored leaves. Margaret sat on the fountain's edge, looking up at Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "What would you do if you could do anything?" she asked. "If Reed Enterprises didn't exist, if your father had been a plumber or a teacher or a doctor, what would Alexander Reed choose to be?" The question startled him. No one had ever asked him that before. Not his father, not his academic advisors, not the women he'd dated over the years. His path had always been so clear, so predetermined, that the question of choice had never really entered into it. "I don't know," he admitted, sitting beside her on the fountain's edge. "That's a rather terrifying realization at 45. "It's never too late to find out," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "Robert changed careers at 40. He'd been in advertising for years, hated every minute of it. Then one day, he just walked away, went back to school, got his teaching certification, said it was the best decision he ever made." Alexander tried to imagine it. Walking away from Reed Enterprises, from the responsibilities and power and identity he'd built over decades. The thought was both liberating and panic-inducing. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from his own existential considerations. If you don't go back to the library, what would you do? Margaret looked surprised, as if the question hadn't occurred to her. I haven't thought that far ahead, she admitted. For so long it was just about getting through each day, making sure Robert was comfortable, managing his medications, coordinating with hospice. After he died, it became about survival in a different way, just breathing in and out, putting one foot in front of the other. And now? She considered this, her face thoughtful. Now, I think I'm ready to start asking those kinds of questions again. What's next? Who I am without him? What I want the rest of my life to look like? A child's laughter pierced the relative quiet of their clearing, followed by the appearance of a little girl of about 4, her dark curls bouncing as she ran toward the fountain. She stopped short when she saw Margaret and Alexander, her eyes wide with the wariness of a child encountering strangers. "Hello," Margaret said, her voice warm and welcoming. The child edged closer, apparently deciding they weren't a threat. "The water's gone," she announced, pointing to the dry fountain with disappointment. "It is," Margaret agreed. "But look what's there instead." She reached into the basin and picked up a particularly vibrant maple leaf, its color a deep, burning red. "Isn't it beautiful?" The little girl nodded, approaching to take the offered leaf. She examined it solemnly, tracing its veins with a tiny finger. "It's like fire," she said. "Emma!" A woman's voice called from the path, and the girl looked up. "That's my mom," she explained unnecessarily. "We're having a picnic." "That sounds lovely," Margaret said. "Thank you for visiting with us." The child nodded, then darted away, clutching her leaf. They watched her go, rejoining a young couple spreading a blanket beneath a nearby tree. "You're good with children," Alexander observed. Margaret nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "We wanted them. It just never happened for us. One of those things you think you have time for until suddenly you don't." The admission hung in the air between them, laden with a particular kind of grief Alexander could only imagine. "I'm sorry," he said, inadequate but sincere. "It's all right," Margaret replied. "We made our peace with it, built a good life anyway." She paused, then added with a sad smile, "Though Robert would have been an amazing father." They watched the young family settle into their picnic, the father lifting the little girl onto his shoulders for a better view of a squirrel in a nearby tree. There was an easiness to their interactions, a sense of family rhythm developed over time and cemented by love. "Have you ever wanted children?" Margaret asked, turning back to Alexander. He shook his head. "I never gave it serious thought. My relationships have been convenient rather than committed, and my lifestyle isn't exactly conducive to family life." "Because of the work hours?" "Partly that." Alexander watched as the father set his daughter down, then tickled her until she collapsed in a fit of giggles. "Partly because I've never seen myself as father material. My own experience of being parented was hardly inspirational." Margaret studied him, her expression thoughtful. "I think people often surprise themselves in that regard. Some of the most unlikely candidates turn out to be wonderful parents." "Perhaps," Alexander conceded. "But it seems a significant risk to take with another human life." The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing and bringing with it a noticeable drop in temperature. Margaret shivered slightly in her dress, which was lovely but not designed for evening chill. "You're cold," Alexander observed, immediately shrugging out of his jacket. "Here." Before Margaret could protest, he'd draped it over her shoulders. The gesture was automatic, instinctive, the kind of chivalry his mother had instilled in him before boarding school and business had hardened him into someone more calculating. "Thank you," Margaret said, pulling the jacket closer around her. It was far too large, making her appear even smaller and more delicate than she was. "But now you'll be cold." "I run warm," Alexander assured her, one of the few benefits of stress and caffeine. Margaret laughed, the sound clear in the gathering dusk. "We should probably head back," she said, though she made no move to rise from the fountain's edge. Alexander nodded, equally reluctant to end their afternoon. "May I drive you home?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "That would be nice." As they walked back toward the museum where Alexander had parked his car, the park around them transformed in the twilight. Lamps flickered on along the pathways, casting pools of golden light at regular intervals. The families with young children had largely departed, replaced by joggers getting in their evening exercise and couples strolling hand in hand. "I've enjoyed today," Margaret said as they reached the park's entrance, "more than I expected to." "As have I," Alexander replied. "Thank you for inviting me." Margaret looked up at him, her expression open and genuine in a way that made Alexander acutely aware of how many of his interactions were marked by calculation and strategy. "To be honest, I almost didn't call you," she admitted. "I wasn't sure if I was ready to let someone new into my life, even just as a friend. And now?" She smiled, a small but genuine expression that transformed her face. "Now I'm glad I did." As they crossed back toward the museum parking lot, Alexander couldn't help but feel that something significant had shifted, not just in his relationship with Margaret, but in his understanding of himself. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd spent an entire day without a single thought for Reed Enterprises, board meetings, or quarterly projections. Instead, he'd been present, truly present, listening to Margaret's stories, sharing his own, observing the life teeming around them in the park. It was, he realized with a start, the most authentic day he'd experienced in years. Alexander's car was an understated luxury sedan, expensive but not ostentatious, much like the man himself. As they drove through the city streets toward Margaret's suburban neighborhood, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by Margaret's occasional directions. "Left at the next light," she instructed, still wearing Alexander's jacket despite the car's perfect temperature. "Then, 2 miles straight ahead." Alexander navigated smoothly through the evening traffic. "I've been thinking about what you said," he ventured after a few minutes. "About figuring out who we are beneath the identities of widow and CEO." Margaret turned to look at him, her profile illuminated by passing streetlights. "And?" "I'm not sure I know how to do that," he admitted. "I've been Alexander Reed, CEO, for so long that I'm not certain what exists underneath." "What about the boy who sketched skyscrapers?" Margaret suggested. "He must still be in there somewhere." Alexander smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but it's been decades since I allowed myself that kind of freedom of imagination. It's like a muscle," Margaret said. "If you don't use it, it atrophies, but you can rebuild it with practice." "Is that what you're doing? Rebuilding?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think I'm still in the demolition phase," she said finally. "Clearing away the rubble before I can even think about new construction." The metaphor struck Alexander as particularly apt. "That takes courage," he observed. "Demolition." "Or desperation," Margaret replied, her voice soft. "Sometimes there's no choice but to tear things down when the foundation has been shaken beyond repair." They arrived at Margaret's house, a modest 2-story colonial with a small front porch. Alexander pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, the sudden silence enveloping them like a cocoon. "Would you like to come in for tea?" Margaret offered, the invitation clearly impulsive, surprising even herself. Alexander hesitated, sensing the significance of the gesture. This was her sanctuary, the place she'd shared with Robert, the setting for both their happiness and his decline. To enter it would cross a threshold more meaningful than the physical doorway. "I'd like that," he said simply. The interior of Margaret's home told Alexander more about her than hours of conversation. The walls were lined with bookshelves, every available surface covered with well-worn volumes organized in a system only Margaret likely understood. Framed photographs documented her life with Robert, their wedding, vacations to those national parks she'd mentioned, casual moments of domestic happiness captured and preserved. Alexander followed her into the kitchen, a warm space with butter-yellow walls and well-used appliances. It wasn't grand by any measure, but it radiated a sense of home that his own sterile penthouse conspicuously lacked. "Make yourself comfortable," Margaret instructed, gesturing toward a small table by a bay window as she filled a kettle and set it on the stove. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer with the tea. I haven't been very diligent about grocery shopping lately." "Just tea is perfect," Alexander assured her, taking a seat and watching as she moved around the kitchen with the muscle memory of someone who had prepared countless meals in this space. As the kettle began to whistle, Margaret reached for an old ceramic teapot, adding loose leaves from a tin. The ritual was clearly familiar, comforting in its ordinariness. She brought the pot to the table along with two mismatched mugs, a small bowl of sugar, and a container of milk. "I don't know how you take your tea," she said, realizing the oversight. "Black is fine," Alexander replied, though in truth he rarely drank tea at all, preferring the efficient caffeine delivery of espresso. Margaret poured for both of them, the fragrant steam rising between them. Alexander took a sip, finding the flavor complex and soothing, nothing like the bland tea bags available in his office kitchen. "This is excellent," he said, genuinely surprised. "Earl Grey with lavender," Margaret explained. "A small indulgence." They drank in companionable silence for a few minutes, the kitchen clock ticking softly in the background. Alexander found himself studying the photographs magnetized to Margaret's refrigerator, more snapshots of her life with Robert, interspersed with postcards from exotic locations and what appeared to be children's artwork. "My nieces and nephews," Margaret explained, following his gaze. "Robert's sister's children. They adored their uncle." Alexander nodded, trying to imagine being the kind of person children would naturally gravitate toward. It seemed as foreign to him as Margaret's cozy kitchen. "May I ask you something?" Margaret said suddenly, setting down her mug. "Something rather direct?" "Of course." "Why did you agree to come to the museum with me today? You hardly know me." The question caught Alexander off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because he hadn't fully examined his own motivations. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "When you called, I felt, I don't know, intrigued, connected somehow. Because we both experienced loss?" "Partly that," Alexander acknowledged, "but it's more than just shared grief. When we talked on the bus and later at the botanical garden, it was the first genuine conversation I'd had in, I can't remember how long. You saw me, not just the title or the company." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand that. After Robert died, people looked at me differently. I was no longer Margaret Walsh, librarian and Robert's wife. I was the widow, an object of pity, someone to be handled with care, as if grief had made me fragile." "Had it?" Alexander asked. "Made you fragile?" Margaret considered this, cradling her mug between her hands. "Not fragile exactly, more like transparent, as if a layer of protection had been stripped away, leaving everything too bright, too sharp, too immediate. And now? Now I'm growing new layers," she said. "Different ones. I'm becoming someone else, not the woman I was before Robert, not the wife I was during our marriage, not even the widow I've been these past months. Someone new." Alexander found himself deeply moved by her articulation of transformation. "I think I envy that," he said quietly, "the capacity for reinvention." "It's not something I chose," Margaret pointed out. "Circumstances forced it upon me." "Even so," Alexander replied, "there's a courage in how you're facing it." Margaret smiled faintly. "Some days are better than others. Today was a good day." "For me as well," Alexander said, suddenly aware of how late it had grown. The kitchen clock showed nearly 10. "I should go, you must be tired." Margaret didn't deny it, rising to clear away their mugs. "Thank you for driving me home, and for the company." "The pleasure was mine," Alexander said, and meant it more sincerely than any pleasantry he'd ever offered. At the front door, Margaret handed him back his jacket. "I almost forgot." "Keep it," Alexander suggested, then immediately felt foolish. "I mean, it's getting cold out. You might need it." Margaret smiled, shaking her head. "I have plenty of jackets, Alexander, but thank you for the gesture." There was a moment of awkwardness as they stood at the threshold, neither quite sure how to end the evening. In a business setting, Alexander would have known precisely how to conclude an interaction, a firm handshake, a clear statement of next steps. But this was unfamiliar territory. "Would you like to do this again?" he asked finally. "Not necessarily the museum, but something?" Margaret nodded, her expression softening. "I would. Maybe next weekend, if you're not too busy with work." "I'll make time," Alexander promised, the declaration surprising him with its firmness. Reed Enterprises had always come first, meetings and business dinners taking precedence over any personal plans. Yet here he was, prioritizing an afternoon with Margaret over whatever corporate demands might arise. "Good night, then," Margaret said, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Good night, Margaret." As Alexander drove home through the quiet suburban streets, he found himself reflecting on the day, not analyzing it for strategic advantage or calculating its impact on his goals, as he might have done with a business meeting, but simply experiencing the warm afterglow of connection. The following weeks brought a succession of shared Saturdays, each one a carefully negotiated balance between closeness and boundaries. They explored the city together, visiting lesser-known museums, walking through neighborhoods Alexander had only ever driven through, discovering small restaurants where no one recognized him as the CEO of Reed Enterprises. For Margaret, these outings became anchors in her week, points of light she could navigate toward through the still-present darkness of grief. She began to look forward to Saturdays, to plan what she might wear, to think about stories she wanted to share with Alexander. The anticipation itself was healing, a reminder that she could still feel something other than sorrow. For Alexander, time with Margaret became a form of liberation, hours when he could step away from the weight of his corporate responsibilities and simply be a man enjoying a woman's companionship. He found himself thinking about her during board meetings, wondering what she would make of the corporate politics that consumed so much of his energy. He began to see his world through her eyes, and often found it wanting. They developed rituals: coffee at a specific cafe before their excursions, a particular bench in the botanical garden where they would sit and talk when the weather permitted, the understanding that Margaret would always choose their lunch spot and Alexander would handle the navigation. Small habits that created a sense of continuity, of something being built between them, brick by careful brick. They were not dating, not in any conventional sense. There were no romantic gestures, no physical intimacy beyond the occasional touch of hands or arm-in-arm walks. Alexander never attempted to kiss Margaret goodnight, though sometimes watching her unlock her front door after he'd driven her home, he found himself wondering what it would be like to cross that boundary. But there was an intimacy of a different sort growing between them. The intimacy of shared thoughts, of vulnerabilities revealed, of difficult truths acknowledged. Margaret told Alexander about the nightmares that still woke her, where she searched endlessly through her house for Robert, knowing he was there but unable to find him. Alexander confessed his recurring fantasy of simply walking away from Reed Enterprises, disappearing to some remote location where no one expected anything of him. 5 weeks after their first museum visit, their carefully established pattern was interrupted. Alexander called Margaret on a Thursday evening, something he rarely did. Their communications typically happened on Saturdays in person or occasionally through brief text messages confirming plans. "I'm sorry to call so late," he began, his voice tighter than usual. "Is everything all right?" Margaret asked, setting aside the book she'd been reading. There's a situation at work, a potential hostile takeover of one of our subsidiaries. I need to fly to London tomorrow morning for emergency meetings with our international partners." "Oh," Margaret said, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course. I understand." "I'll miss our Saturday," Alexander continued, and she could hear the genuine regret in his voice. "I'm not sure when I'll be back. These negotiations could take days, possibly longer." "It's fine, Alexander. Your work is important." There was a pause on the line. "It used to feel that way," he said finally. "Unquestionably important. Now I'm not so sure." Margaret wasn't certain how to respond to this. "Safe travels," she said instead. "Let me know when you're back." "I will," he promised. "And Margaret, I truly am sorry." After they hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet living room, surprised by the depth of her disappointment. She'd grown accustomed to their Saturdays, had been looking forward to showing Alexander a small independent bookstore she'd discovered in her old neighborhood. Now the weekend stretched before her, empty and formless. It was a necessary reminder, she thought, of the reality of their situation. Alexander's life was shaped by responsibilities she could barely comprehend. Her own existence was still defined by the absence at its center. Whatever this connection between them was, it existed in a fragile bubble, protected from the harsher realities of their separate worlds. For the first time since Robert's death, Margaret found herself facing not just grief, but uncertainty about the future. A future that somehow had begun to include Alexander Reed in ways she hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure she was ready for. London greeted Alexander with persistent drizzle and gray skies, a fitting backdrop for his mood. The corporate apartment in Mayfair, a sleek, impersonal space Reed Enterprises maintained for executive travel, felt particularly empty as he dropped his suitcase by the door and surveyed the familiar furnishings. He'd stayed here dozens of times over the years, never giving much thought to its sterile luxury. Now, coming directly from Margaret's warm, book-filled home, the contrast was jarring. The series of meetings that had pulled him across the Atlantic were exactly as tedious and contentious as he'd expected. Cornerstone Technologies, a British software company Reed Enterprises had acquired 3 years earlier, was facing an aggressive takeover bid from a European conglomerate. Alexander's presence was necessary to reassure investors, strategize with the executive team, and, if he was being honest, demonstrate the Reed family's continued commitment to the business his father had built. Between meetings, in the brief moments when he wasn't surrounded by attorneys and financial advisors, Alexander found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Margaret. He wondered what she was doing, whether she'd found another way to spend her Saturday, if she was thinking of him at all. These distractions were unprecedented in his professional life. Typically, when Alexander was working, his focus was laser-sharp, his mind fully engaged with the business at hand. This new, divided attention both irritated and intrigued him. On Sunday evening, after a particularly grueling session with Cornerstone's board, Alexander returned to the apartment and found himself doing something he'd never done before during a business trip. He called Margaret, not to discuss a schedule change or make practical arrangements, but simply because he wanted to hear her voice. "I hope I'm not calling too late," he said when she answered, calculating the time difference and realizing it was mid-afternoon for her. "Not at all," Margaret replied, the warmth in her tone immediately loosening something in Alexander's chest. "How's London?" "Wet, grey, full of lawyers." He moved to the apartment's wall of windows, looking out at the city lights glimmering in the persistent rain. "How was your weekend?" "Quiet," Margaret admitted. "I finally tackled some projects around the house I've been avoiding, sorted through some of Robert's things." The mention of her late husband no longer created awkwardness between them. Over their weeks of Saturday outings, Robert had become a presence they both acknowledged. Not a barrier, but a fact of Margaret's life that Alexander had come to respect and even appreciate through her stories. "That must have been difficult," he said. "It was," Margaret agreed. "But also, necessary, healing in a way. I kept some things that mean a lot to me, made a donation pile for the rest. Progress, Alexander observed. Small steps, Margaret amended. How are your meetings going? Alexander sighed, rubbing the tension at the back of his neck. As expected. Corporate warfare dressed up in boardroom civility. My father would have relished it. And you don't? The question gave Alexander pause. Once he would have said he did enjoy these high-stakes corporate battles. The strategy, the maneuvering, the eventual victory. Now, he wasn't so sure. I find myself questioning the point of it all, he admitted. We'll win this fight. Cornerstone will remain under the Reed Enterprises umbrella. The stock price will stabilize, and then there will be another crisis, another company to save or acquire or divest. The endless cycle of corporate life, Margaret said, and Alexander could hear the smile in her voice gently teasing. Exactly. Increasingly, I'm wondering what it's all for. Have you always felt this way? Alexander considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. I used to believe implicitly in what I was doing. Building the Reed legacy, growing the company, creating jobs, all the justifications for the endless meetings and missed personal milestones. What changed? My father died, Alexander said simply. And then I met you. The statement hung between them, honest in a way that surprised them both. Alexander hadn't planned to say it, hadn't even fully articulated the thought to himself until that moment. Me? Margaret sounded genuinely surprised. What do I have to do with your corporate existential crisis? Alexander smiled at her phrasing. You see things differently. You make me see things differently. All those Saturdays, showing me parts of the city I've lived in for decades but never really seen. Asking questions no one else asks me. Making me consider options I'd never entertained. I didn't realize I was being so revolutionary, Margaret said, but he could hear she was pleased. You have no idea, Alexander told her, meaning it more than she could know. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing naturally from topic to topic. Margaret told him about a book she'd started reading. Alexander described an architectural detail on one of London's older buildings that had caught his eye during the taxi ride from the airport. It was ordinary conversation, the kind millions of people had every day, yet Alexander found it extraordinary in its simple intimacy. As they said goodbye, Alexander realized he felt more refreshed by that hour on the phone than he had by entire vacations in the past. Something about Margaret's voice, her perspective, her gentle humor, had the power to center him in a way nothing else in his life did. The next morning, entering the Cornerstone offices, Alexander made a decision. He called Helen, his executive assistant back in the States. I need you to clear my calendar for the coming weekend, he instructed. I'll be extending my stay in London through Sunday, but I won't be available for business meetings after Friday afternoon. Extended stay? That's unusual, Helen remarked, not bothering to hide her surprise. In all the years she'd worked with Alexander, he had never voluntarily spent an extra day on a business trip. Typically, he was on the first flight home the moment negotiations concluded. Yes, well, I've decided to do some sightseeing, Alexander said, aware of how out of character this sounded. Sightseeing? Helen repeated slowly. In London, a city you visited at least 30 times for business. Is that so hard to believe? Frankly, yes, Helen replied, her decades of service giving her license for candor. Are you feeling all right, Alexander? He laughed, drawing curious glances from the Cornerstone executives gathering for their morning meeting. I'm fine, Helen. Better than I've been in a long time, actually. Just clear the calendar, please. After hanging up, Alexander sent a text to Margaret, extending my trip through the weekend, taking some time to explore London properly. Wish you were here to see it with me. The response came minutes later. I've never been to London. Take pictures for me? Alexander smiled, tucking his phone away as the meeting began. For the first time in days, he felt fully engaged, eager to resolve the cornerstone crisis efficiently so he could turn his attention to something more personally meaningful. Back in the States, Margaret was experiencing her own subtle shift in perspective. Alexander's call had been unexpected but welcome, brightening a Sunday that had stretched emptily before her. Their conversation had left her feeling lighter, more connected to the world beyond her grief. On Monday morning, on an impulse she didn't examine too closely, Margaret found herself driving to the public library where she'd worked before Robert's illness. She hadn't been inside since resigning her position 2 months earlier, and approaching the familiar brick building sent a flutter of anxiety through her chest. Diane Lawson, the head librarian and Margaret's former supervisor, looked up in surprise as Margaret entered her office. A woman in her early 60s with a penchant for statement jewelry and progressive politics, Diane had been a mentor to Margaret throughout her career. "Margaret Walsh," she exclaimed, rising to envelop her in a warm hug. "What a wonderful surprise." "Hi, Diane," Margaret replied, returning the embrace. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by." It was a transparent fiction. No one was ever in the neighborhood of the library, which sat on its own campus at the edge of town, but Diane accepted it graciously, inviting Margaret to sit. "How are you?" she asked, her tone suggesting the question was genuine rather than perfunctory. "I'm better," Margaret said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Not whole, not yet, but better." "I'm glad to hear it," Diane said, studying her with kind eyes. "We've missed you around here. The special collections aren't the same without your touch." Margaret glanced around the office, taking in the familiar academic clutter, the framed photographs of Diane with various authors who had visited the library over the years, the ever-present scent of books and coffee. "I've missed it too," she admitted, "more than I expected to." "Your position is still open," Diane said carefully. "We've been making do with part-time coverage, but the board approved holding it for you for up to 6 months. You've got another 8 weeks if you want to come back." Margaret hadn't come with the intention of discussing her job, but now that the subject had been raised, she found herself considering it seriously. The library had been her professional home for over a decade. The work was meaningful, engaging, perfectly suited to her skills and interests. She'd resigned in the fog of grief, convinced she couldn't bear to return to any aspect of her pre-loss life. Now, she wondered if that had been a mistake. "Could I think about it?" she asked. Diane smiled, clearly pleased. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Well, within the 8-week window, that is." As Margaret left the library, she felt a curious lightness, as if some burden she'd been carrying had shifted slightly. The possibility of returning to work, of reclaiming that piece of her identity, was both frightening and exhilarating. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but for the first time since Robert's death, she was considering a future that involved more than just enduring each day. She texted Alexander, "Visited the library today. They're still holding my position. Thinking about going back." In London, emerging from an afternoon of depositions, Alexander felt his phone vibrate with Margaret's message. He read it with a surge of pleasure and pride on her behalf. Reaching out, considering a return to work, these were significant steps forward from the grieving woman he'd met on the bus just weeks ago. "Excellent news," he responded. "The literary world needs you." "What prompted the visit?" Margaret's reply came quickly. "Not sure exactly. Our conversation yesterday, maybe. Realizing life goes on, whether I participate or not. Might as well participate." Alexander smiled, pocketing his phone as he entered yet another meeting. Margaret's words stayed with him through the afternoon of legal wrangling and financial projections. "Life goes on, whether I participate or not." It was a simple observation, but one that resonated deeply with his own recent questioning. For years he had been participating in a life he'd never actively chosen, one predetermined by his father's expectations and the demands of Reed Enterprises. What would it mean to truly choose his own path? To actively participate in creating a life that reflected his own values and desires rather than fulfilling someone else's vision? By Friday afternoon, the cornerstone crisis had been resolved largely in Reed Enterprises' favor. The European conglomerate had been repelled, key executives had been persuaded to remain with the company, and a strategic plan had been developed to prevent similar vulnerabilities in the future. Alexander should have felt triumphant. Instead, as the final contracts were signed and hands were shaken all around, he felt only relief that the business portion of his trip was concluded. Now the real purpose of his extended stay could begin. That evening, in the corporate apartment, Alexander packed away his business suits and ties, replacing them with the casual clothes he'd asked Helen to have shipped overnight from his home. Then he sat down with a guidebook to London he'd purchased in the Cornerstone Building's gift shop, planning a weekend of exploration with a meticulousness usually reserved for corporate strategy. As he marked pages and made notes, Alexander realized he was imagining Margaret's responses to each potential site. Her delight at the British Library's treasures, her interest in the architectural details of St. Paul's Cathedral, her amusement at the street performers in Covent Garden. Without intending to, he had begun to see the city through her eyes, to anticipate her perspective. It was, he reflected, a novel way of experiencing the world, not solely through the lens of profit and loss, strategic advantage and corporate positioning, but through human connection, shared appreciation, the simple joy of discovery. Alexander Reed, CEO of Reed Enterprises, would never have extended a business trip for personal exploration. But Alexander, the man who sketched skyscrapers as a boy, the man who was learning to see the world anew through Margaret Walsh's perceptive eyes, that Alexander was eager for the weekend to begin. Saturday morning in London dawned surprisingly clear, the persistent drizzle of the past week giving way to pale sunshine. Alexander stood at the apartment windows, coffee in hand, watching the city come to life below. He was accustomed to viewing London from conference rooms and business-class lounges, experiencing it as a backdrop for corporate transactions rather than a destination in itself. Today would be different. He'd mapped out an ambitious itinerary, beginning with the British Museum in the morning, followed by a walk through Regent's Park, lunch at a small cafe he'd researched that specialized in traditional English fare, and an afternoon at the Tate Modern. It was the kind of day he might have planned for Margaret, had she been there, a blend of culture, nature, and local experience. As he navigated the bustling Saturday crowds, Alexander found himself noticing details he'd previously overlooked despite dozens of visits to the city. The particular quality of London light, soft and diffuse, the musical cadence of British English as it flowed around him, the centuries of history layered in the architecture that lined even the most ordinary streets. In the British Museum, he wandered through galleries filled with artifacts from ancient civilizations, finding himself drawn not to the grandest treasures but to small personal items, a Roman child's toy, an Egyptian cosmetic jar, a medieval pilgrim's badge, objects that spoke of individual lives lived millennia ago, connections across time that transcended the temporary nature of corporate achievements. Alexander took photographs as he went, not the standard tourist shots of famous exhibits, but details he thought might interest Margaret. The intricate pattern on a piece of ancient pottery, the play of light through the museum's glass ceiling, a particularly expressive stone carving. With each image, he composed a mental note to share with her when he returned home. At lunchtime, he found the small cafe he'd researched and asked for a table for one, a request that would have seemed utterly natural a few months ago but now felt strangely hollow. The meal was excellent, but Alexander found himself wishing for Margaret's company, her observations, her quiet laugh when something amused her. The thought struck him with unexpected force. He missed her. Not in the abstract, theoretical way he occasionally missed human connection during particularly isolated periods of work, but specifically and concretely. He missed Margaret Walsh with her silver-streaked auburn hair and perceptive green eyes, her thoughtful questions and careful listening. Alexander pulled out his phone and sent her a picture of his traditional English pudding dessert with the caption, experiencing local culture. Wish you were here to explain the culinary significance. The response came minutes later. That's Spotted Dick. Yes, terrible name, endless source of amusement for American tourists. Suet pudding with dried fruit. Robert and I had it on our trip to the Lake District years ago. I was too polite to say I found it rather heavy. Alexander smiled, feeling oddly comforted by this small exchange. Even an ocean away, Margaret's perspective enriched his experience, added layers of meaning and connection that transformed a solitary meal into something shared. The remainder of the day unfolded in similar fashion, Alexander exploring London's landmarks and hidden corners, sending occasional photos and observations to Margaret, receiving her responses with a pleasure that surprised him in its intensity. By evening, as he sat in a small jazz club in Soho that his guidebook had recommended, Alexander found himself contemplating what it would be like to actually travel with Margaret, to experience new places in her company rather than just through digital correspondence. The thought was both enticing and intimidating. Travel together would represent a significant step forward in whatever relationship they were building, a shift from Saturday afternoon outings to something more substantial, more deliberately intimate. Alexander wasn't sure if Margaret was ready for such a step. He wasn't entirely sure if he was ready himself. Back in her suburban home, Margaret was having similar thoughts as she moved through her Saturday routine, now punctuated by Alexander's messages from London. Each photograph, each brief observation created a curious sense of connection despite the physical distance between them. She found herself looking forward to his messages, wondering where his self-guided tour would take him next, what details would catch his eye. In the afternoon, while sorting through a box of Robert's books she'd been avoiding, Margaret came across a London travel guide they'd used during their one trip to England 8 years earlier. Inside, Robert had tucked ticket stubs, receipts, and brochures, small mementos of their adventure together. Where once finding such items would have triggered overwhelming grief, now Margaret felt a bittersweet nostalgia, a fondness for the memories without the crushing weight of loss. She texted Alexander, "Found our old London guidebook." Robert circled all the pubs with historical significance, his excuse for a proper British pub crawl. I preferred the gardens and smaller museums. We compromised with Westminster Abbey, history for him, architecture for me. Alexander's response came quickly. I can see that compromise. Currently at the Tate Modern. I think you'd appreciate the juxtaposition of industrial architecture and contemporary art, making mental notes for when you visit someday. When you visit someday. The phrase lingered in Margaret's mind as she continued sorting books. Was that a casual observation or a more deliberate suggestion? And how did she feel about the possibility it represented? For so long after Robert's death, Margaret had lived entirely in the present moment, unable to contemplate a future that stretched beyond the next day or week. The very concept of making plans, of looking forward to events or experiences months ahead, had seemed impossible, almost offensive in the face of her grief. Now she found herself considering the possibility of someday visiting London again, with Alexander. The thought wasn't as jarring as it might have been even a few weeks earlier. Their Saturday outings had become a comfortable routine, a friendship that was gradually becoming an important part of her life. Was it so inconceivable that this connection might extend to shared travels, to experiences beyond the boundaries of their city? As evening fell, Margaret made herself a simple dinner and brought it to the couch where she'd been reading one of Robert's favorite novels, rediscovering it through the lens of memory and affection. Her phone chimed with another message from Alexander, this one a photo of a small jazz club, the image slightly blurred by low light, but capturing the intimate atmosphere of small tables, a trio of musicians on a tiny stage, glasses of amber liquid catching the glow of table lamps. End-of-day exploration, he'd written. Live music seems the appropriate conclusion to a day of cultural immersion. The trio is playing Coltrane. I think you'd approve. Margaret smiled, remembering a conversation they'd had weeks earlier about music when she'd mentioned her fondness for classic jazz. Alexander had admitted to knowing little about the genre beyond what he heard in upscale hotel lobbies, and Margaret had promised to educate him someday. Apparently, he'd taken the initiative to begin his education without her. She replied, "Perfect end to the day. Coltrane would definitely meet with my approval. London has excellent jazz clubs. Another thing Robert and I agreed on completely." After sending the message, Margaret realized she'd referenced Robert twice in her communications with Alexander that day, both times without the pang of loss that usually accompanied speaking his name. Instead, she'd shared memories naturally, as part of her history rather than as open wounds. It felt like progress, a small but significant shift in how she carried her grief. On Sunday morning, Alexander continued his exploration of London, visiting St. Paul's Cathedral for the early service. Not out of any particular religious conviction, but because his guidebook suggested it was the best way to experience the cathedral's magnificent acoustics. Sitting in the ancient space, surrounded by sublime architecture and soaring music, Alexander found himself moved in unexpected ways. He wasn't a spiritual man by nature. His upbringing had included obligatory appearances at an Episcopal church for Christmas, Easter, and the occasional society wedding, but faith had never been a meaningful part of his life. Yet something about the beauty of the space, the sense of centuries of human experience contained within its walls, resonated with the questions he'd been asking himself lately about meaning, purpose, and legacy. When the service concluded, Alexander remained in his seat, watching sunlight filter through stained glass to create pools of color on the stone floor. On impulse, he texted Margaret, "At St. Paul's this morning. There's a quiet here that feels almost physical, as if centuries of prayers have created their own atmosphere. Have you ever experienced something similar?" Margaret, just waking up across the ocean, read his message with surprise. It was more philosophical, more introspective than Alexander's previous texts, which had been primarily observational and informative. This felt like a genuine question, an invitation to a deeper level of conversation. She replied thoughtfully, "Yes, in certain ancient places. Once in a small stone chapel in rural France, so old the walls seemed to exhale history. Robert called it the weight of accumulated human intention. Whatever you call it, it's humbling." Alexander read her response, struck by the phrase, "the weight of accumulated human intention." It captured exactly what he was feeling in the cathedral, a sense of connection to something larger and more enduring than quarterly reports and corporate acquisitions. Again, Margaret had provided the words for an experience he was struggling to articulate, bridging the gap between sensation and understanding. As he left St. Paul's and continued his exploration of the city, Alexander found himself contemplating what truly lasted, what remained meaningful across centuries. The cathedral had been built in the 17th century, surviving wars, fires, the Blitz, witnessing coronations and funerals, standing solid while generations came and went, while empires rose and fell. What would remain of Reed Enterprises in 300 years? What would remain of him? These were uncomfortable questions for a man who had spent his adult life focused on tangible achievements, measurable success, concrete goals. Yet they persisted, echoing in his mind as he walked through London's historic streets, as he observed buildings that had outlasted their creators by centuries, as he moved among the weekend crowds, each person engaged in their own journey of significance and meaning. By Sunday evening, as Alexander prepared for his Monday morning flight back to the States, he found himself reluctant to return to the world of boardrooms and balance sheets. His weekend of exploration had shifted something fundamental in his perspective, or perhaps more accurately, had accelerated a shift that began the day he sat next to Margaret on a city bus. He sent her a final message from London, "Heading home tomorrow. Thank you for being my virtual tour guide this weekend. Seeing the city differently because of you. Our next Saturday?" Margaret's response was simple but warming. Safe travels. Looking forward to hearing all about it in person. Yes to Saturday. My turn to choose the destination. As Alexander packed his suitcase, methodically folding suits and casual clothes with equal care, he reflected on how much had changed in the relatively short time since he'd met Margaret. He had spent a lifetime being Alexander Reed, CEO, heir to the Reed business empire, caretaker of his father's legacy. Now, approaching 50, he was discovering what it might mean to simply be Alexander, a man with interests beyond quarterly projections, with questions about purpose and meaning, with a growing capacity for genuine connection. It was unsettling, this emergence of a self he barely recognized. Unsettling, but also strangely liberating. For the first time in decades, Alexander found himself looking forward not just to a specific event or achievement, but to the process of discovery itself, to finding out who he might become if he allowed himself the freedom to evolve. And central to this process, though he was only beginning to acknowledge it, was Margaret Walsh, the grieving widow he'd met by chance, whose quiet strength and perceptive understanding had somehow begun to illuminate paths he'd never before considered. Alexander's flight landed Tuesday afternoon, a day later than originally scheduled due to weather delays in London. The extended travel left him jet-lagged and disoriented, his body and mind caught between time zones. He barely remembered the drive from the airport to his penthouse, where he collapsed into bed and slept for 14 uninterrupted hours, something he couldn't recall doing since college. Wednesday morning found him back at Reed Enterprises headquarters, immersed in the aftermath of the Cornerstone crisis. There were reports to review, teams to brief, board members to reassure. Alexander moved through these familiar motions with practiced efficiency, but something had changed. He found himself observing his corporate world as if from a slight distance, noting the choreographed deference of his employees, the political maneuvering of his executives, the relentless focus on growth and acquisition that had defined Reed Enterprises since its founding. Helen noticed the shift immediately. "You seem different," she remarked, bringing him a stack of correspondence that had accumulated during his absence. "London agreed with you." Alexander glanced up, surprised by her perception. "Does it show that much?" "Only to someone who's known you for 20 years, Helen replied with a small smile. "You're more present somehow, less driven." "Is that a problem?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious about how his subtle transformation might be perceived by others. Helen considered this. "Not a problem," she said finally. "Just different. Interesting." Throughout the week, Alexander found himself increasingly impatient with the minutiae of corporate governance. Meetings that once would have engaged his full attention now seemed tedious and ultimately inconsequential. Strategic decisions that would have consumed hours of careful consideration were dispatched with newfound decisiveness. Several executives commented on his unusual efficiency, interpreting it as heightened focus rather than what it actually was, a growing awareness of how little any of it truly mattered to him personally. Each evening, Alexander exchanged brief messages with Margaret, their daily communication now established as a comfortable routine. She shared her progress on reorganizing her home office, mentioned a lunch with former colleagues from the library, described a book she was reading. He told her about readjusting to the time difference, sent her additional photos from London he'd forgotten to share while there, asked her opinion on articles he'd read that reminded him of conversations they'd had. These exchanges, simple as they were, became the highlight of Alexander's days. In a life that had been dominated by professional obligations, the emergence of a purely personal connection, one based on genuine interest rather than strategic advantage, felt revolutionary. Saturday couldn't arrive soon enough. As agreed before his London trip, it was Margaret's turn to choose their destination. She'd been mysteriously vague about her plans, telling Alexander only to dress casually and be prepared to spend most of the day outdoors. When he arrived at her house that morning, Alexander found Margaret waiting on the front porch, a wicker picnic basket at her feet. She wore jeans and a forest green sweater that matched her eyes, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders rather than in the neat bun she typically favored. The sight of her, relaxed, casually beautiful, clearly pleased to see him, created a warmth in Alexander's chest that had nothing to do with the mild autumn sunshine. "Welcome back, traveler," Margaret greeted him, picking up the basket as she stood. "Ready for a very American adventure after your London explorations?" "Intrigued and ready," Alexander confirmed, reaching to take the basket from her. "Though I should warn you that my outdoor experiences are generally limited to golf courses and the occasional corporate retreat." Margaret laughed, relinquishing the basket. "Then today will be educational for you. We're going apple picking." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Apple picking? As in physically removing apples from trees ourselves rather than selecting them from a grocery display?" "Exactly that," Margaret confirmed, locking her front door. "There's an orchard about 30 minutes north of here. Robert and I used to go every fall. They have dozens of varieties, a small farm store with ridiculous cider donuts, hay rides for the children." She trailed off, suddenly uncertain. "It might seem silly to you." "Not silly," Alexander assured her quickly. "Just unfamiliar. I don't think I've ever been to an orchard." "Then you're in for a treat," Margaret said, her confidence returning. "It's a perfect fall day for it." The drive north took them out of the city and into increasingly rural landscapes. Alexander found himself studying Margaret's profile as she drove, noticing subtle changes since they'd last seen each other in person. There was more color in her cheeks, a greater ease in her movements, a lightness about her that hadn't been there before. Grief still shadowed her eyes at times, but it no longer seemed to define her completely. "Tell me about your week," Alexander said as they passed through a small town with a quintessential New England Main Street, white church steeple, town green, brick storefronts with striped awnings. Margaret glanced his way briefly before returning her attention to the road. "I went back to the library," she said. "Not just to visit, but to discuss returning to work." "That's wonderful," Alexander said, genuinely pleased. "What did you decide?" "I'm going back next Monday," Margaret replied, a blend of nervousness and determination in her voice. 3 days a week to start. Diane, my boss, was wonderfully accommodating. Said I could ease back in however I felt comfortable. "I'm happy for you," Alexander said. "The world needs more dedicated librarians." Margaret smiled at that. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "But also ready, I think. Ready to reclaim that part of myself." "That's brave," Alexander observed, stepping back into life like that. "Is it?" Margaret seemed surprised by his characterization. "It doesn't feel brave. It feels necessary, like I've been holding my breath for months and finally need to exhale." They turned off the main road onto a gravel drive that wound through woods beginning to show autumn color. Emerging from the trees, they came upon the orchard, neat rows of apple trees stretching across gently rolling hills, dotted with families and couples carrying baskets and reaching for fruit. A red barn housed the farm store, where a line had already formed for the apparently famous cider donuts. Alexander helped Margaret gather their picnic supplies, then followed her into the orchard, where she navigated the rows with the confidence of someone returning to a familiar place. She explained the different varieties as they walked: Macintosh for applesauce, Granny Smith for pies, Honey Crisp for eating fresh. Alexander listened, fascinated less by the information itself than by Margaret's evident pleasure in sharing it. They found a secluded section of Cortland trees, their branches heavy with deep red fruit. Margaret demonstrated the proper picking technique, cupping the apple in her palm, lifting slightly, and twisting gently until the stem separated from the branch. "Your turn," she said, stepping back to allow Alexander access to a particularly perfect specimen just above his head. Alexander mimicked her movements, feeling oddly self-conscious as he reached for the apple. It came away easily in his hand, surprisingly warm from the sun, its skin smooth and flawless against his palm. "Well done," Margaret approved. "You're a natural." "Hardly," Alexander replied, turning the apple to admire its perfect roundness. But I can see the appeal. There's something satisfying about it. Isn't there? Margaret agreed, reaching for another apple. It's so tangible, immediate. You can literally enjoy the fruits of your labor. They continued picking, filling the canvas bag Margaret had brought, occasionally sampling different varieties to compare flavors. The simplicity of the activity, reaching, twisting, the soft thud of apples landing on other apples, created a rhythmic tranquility Alexander hadn't experienced in years. No phones rang, no assistants interrupted with urgent messages, no decisions required anything more complex than which apple to select next. When the bag grew heavy, they found a grassy spot at the edge of the orchard, spreading the blanket Margaret had packed and arranging their picnic lunch. Crusty bread, several types of cheese, grapes, small containers of pickled vegetables, and slices of chocolate cake Alexander recognized from a bakery near his office. "You went downtown for dessert?" he asked, surprised. Margaret nodded, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "You mentioned once that it was your favorite. I thought it would be a nice, welcome-home addition." The gesture moved Alexander more than he could express. The fact that she'd remembered such a casual comment, that she'd gone out of her way to include it in their day. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something so thoughtfully specific for him, with no agenda beyond his pleasure. They ate in companionable silence, watching families move through the orchard, listening to children's laughter and the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The autumn sun was warm but not hot, the air crisp without being cold, a perfect balance that seemed to reflect the evolving relationship between them, neither too intense nor too distant. "I visited my lawyer this week," Margaret said suddenly, setting down her napkin, "to discuss Robert's estate." Alexander waited, sensing she had more to say. "There was an insurance policy I'd forgotten about," she continued. "Nothing enormous, but enough that I don't have to worry about finances for quite a while. I can work at the library because I want to, not because I need to." "That must be a relief," Alexander said. Margaret nodded. "It is. But it also made me realize something. I've been using practical concerns, money, the house, Robert's things, as a way to avoid bigger questions, like what I actually want my life to look like now." Alexander understood this completely. "Focusing on the tangible is easier than confronting the existential," he observed. "I've been doing the same thing with work for years." "Exactly," Margaret agreed, looking relieved at his understanding. "But I think I'm ready to start asking those bigger questions and answering them honestly, even if the answers are uncomfortable." There was a vulnerability in her expression that made Alexander want to reach for her hand to offer some physical reassurance. Instead, he asked, "What questions are you starting with?" Margaret looked out across the orchard, her profile outlined against the autumn landscape. "Am I staying in that house because I want to, or because leaving feels like abandoning Robert? Am I holding on to certain habits, certain ways of seeing myself, because they're comfortable or because they're right for who I am now?" She turned back to Alexander. "What about you? What questions are you asking?" The directness of her gaze demanded equal honesty. "Is Reed Enterprises what I want or what was expected of me? Have I been measuring success by meaningful metrics or simply by the ones I inherited? What would I do if I were truly free to choose?" "And do you have answers yet?" Margaret asked softly. Alexander shook his head. "Not fully formed ones, but I'm starting to see outlines, possibilities I wouldn't have considered 6 months ago." "Because of your father's death?" Margaret suggested. "Partly," Alexander agreed, "and partly because of you." Margaret looked startled. "Me? What have I done?" "You've shown me a different way of measuring what matters," Alexander said simply. "Through your grief, your resilience, your willingness to rebuild. You've helped me see beyond the narrow confines of the world I've inhabited." A subtle shift occurred between them in that moment, a deepening, a recognition that whatever was developing between them had transcended casual friendship. They were changing each other, influencing each other's paths in ways neither had anticipated when Margaret sat down next to Alexander on that rainy morning bus. As the afternoon began to wane, they packed up their picnic and made one last circuit through the orchard, selecting a few final perfect specimens. At the farm store, Alexander insisted on buying a half-dozen cider donuts, still warm from the fryer, which they ate on the drive home, sugar dusting their fingers and laps. "Thank you for today," Alexander said as they neared the city, "for sharing this with me." Margaret glanced at him, a smile playing at her lips. "Even though it wasn't a sophisticated London jazz club?" "Especially because it wasn't," Alexander replied. "I've had enough sophistication to last a lifetime. What I've been missing is—" He searched for the right word. "Authenticity?" Margaret suggested. "Yes," Alexander agreed. "Exactly that." As they drove back toward Margaret's house, the car filled with the sweet scent of fresh apples and the comfortable silence of two people no longer afraid of what might be growing between them, Alexander found himself contemplating a future very different from any he'd previously imagined. One with fewer boardrooms and more orchards, less strategy and more spontaneity. One that might, if he were brave enough to reach for it, include the remarkable woman beside him, not just for Saturday outings but for the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a shared life. The thought should have terrified him. Alexander Reed, contemplating major life changes because of a chance meeting on public transportation. Instead, it filled him with a curious calm, a sense of rightness that no corporate acquisition or business triumph had ever provided. Margaret pulled into her driveway as dusk was falling, the sky painted in soft pinks and purples. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, her invitation weighted with potential meanings. "We could make apple crisp with some of our haul." "I'd like that very much," Alexander replied, the simplicity of his answer belying the complexity of what he was beginning to feel. Together, they gathered their day's harvest and walked toward Margaret's front door, stepping from the fading light into whatever might come next. Winter melted into spring and spring blossomed into early summer. The months following their apple orchard excursion had brought changes neither Margaret nor Alexander could have anticipated when they first sat beside each other on that rainy morning bus. Margaret had fully returned to her position at the library, her expertise in special collections welcomed back with enthusiasm by colleagues and patrons alike. The familiar routines of cataloging, research, and conservation had helped her rebuild a sense of purpose. She still carried her grief for Robert. That would never entirely disappear, but it had transformed from a crushing weight into something she could bear, a part of her story rather than its defining chapter. For Alexander, the transformation had been more dramatic and public. 3 months after his London trip, he had made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the business world. He was stepping down as CEO of Reed Enterprises. The decision, though presented to the board and the press as the natural evolution of the company's leadership structure, had its roots in the questions he had begun asking himself since meeting Margaret. Alexander hadn't abandoned the company entirely. He had transitioned to the role of chairman, maintaining strategic oversight while delegating day-to-day operations to a carefully selected leadership team. The move had freed him to pursue other interests, particularly a new foundation focused on historic architecture preservation and public space creation in urban environments. Throughout these changes, Margaret and Alexander's connection had deepened steadily. Their Saturday outings expanded to include weeknight dinners, Sunday morning walks in the botanical garden, and occasional weekends exploring nearby towns. They moved slowly, respectful of Margaret's continued healing and Alexander's adjustment to a radically different lifestyle, but with a growing certainty that what they had found in each other was worth nurturing. On a perfect June morning, exactly 1 year after their chance meeting on the bus, Alexander stood in Margaret's kitchen, watching as she prepared a thermos of coffee for their planned hike in a nearby state park. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patterns across the wooden countertops. In the year since he'd first entered this house, it had subtly changed, still filled with memories of Robert, but now containing traces of Alexander as well. His favorite coffee mug in the cabinet, a few of his books on the shelves. A jacket he'd left behind during a sudden spring shower, now hanging casually on the coat rack as if it belonged there. "Almost ready," Margaret said, securing the thermos lid. "Just need to grab the trail map from my office." As she left the kitchen, Alexander's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen displayed Helen's name, still his executive assistant, though her role had evolved along with his. "Helen," he answered. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," she assured him. "Just wanted to confirm you received the revised proposal for the Portland project. The board meeting is Monday, and Thompson is likely to have questions about the budget allocation." "I received it," Alexander confirmed. "Reviewed it last night. The numbers look solid." "And you'll be at the dinner tonight?" "The mayor's office confirmed, and they're expecting you to say a few words about the foundation's first year." Alexander smiled at Helen's persistent efficiency. Even with his reduced corporate responsibilities, she remained determined to keep him organized. "Yes, I'll be there. 7 o'clock at the Hawthorne, correct?" "Correct. And will Margaret be joining you?" The question was asked casually, but Alexander knew it represented a significant evolution in how his personal and professional lives had begun to integrate. A year ago, he would never have considered bringing a companion to a business event. Now, Margaret's presence at his side at various functions had become almost expected. "Not tonight," Alexander replied. "She has a library fundraiser she's committed to." After ending the call, Alexander found himself contemplating how dramatically his life had changed. A year ago, he would have been in the office on a Saturday morning, not preparing for a hike. Business calls would have dominated his day, not been brief interruptions to personal plans. And he certainly wouldn't have been standing in the sunny kitchen of a woman who had somehow quietly and without fanfare become the center of his world. Margaret returned with the trail map, folding it into the small backpack she'd prepared with water, snacks, and sunscreen. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting his thoughtful expression. "Just Helen confirming details for tonight's dinner," Alexander explained. "And I was thinking about how much has changed in a year." Margaret smiled, coming to stand beside him at the counter. "Having second thoughts about giving up the corner office?" "Not for a moment," Alexander replied honestly. "Though I still wake up sometimes at 5 a.m. reaching for a non-existent conference call." "Old habits," Margaret observed, arranging apples in the backpack, a sweet reminder of their orchard outing months earlier. "It takes time to build new ones." "Speaking of which," Alexander said, reaching for her hand, "I've been thinking about something." Margaret looked up, her expression curious. They had developed a deep trust over the months, a comfort in sharing thoughts and feelings that was still sometimes surprising to them both. "I've been looking at properties," Alexander continued, "for the Foundation's headquarters, and I found a building I think you should see." "Oh?" Margaret's interest was genuine. She had become increasingly involved in Alexander's foundation work, her librarian's expertise in historical research providing valuable context for preservation projects. "It's an old library, actually," Alexander explained. "Built in 1910, been sitting vacant for almost a decade. Beautiful architecture, but it needs significant restoration." Margaret's eyes lit with interest. "Where is it?" "About an hour north of here, in a small town called Maple Ridge." Alexander hesitated, then added, "I was thinking we could drive up tomorrow to look at it. Maybe have lunch at the inn there. I hear it's quite charming." "That sounds lovely," Margaret agreed, "though I'm surprised you're considering a headquarters so far from the city." Alexander took a deep breath, preparing to share the thoughts that had been developing in his mind for weeks. "That's the thing. I'm not just thinking about the Foundation headquarters. I'm thinking about making other changes." Margaret set down the backpack, giving him her full attention. "What kind of changes?" "I'm considering selling my penthouse," Alexander said. "Moving somewhere quieter, somewhere with more space, more character, less of a monument to corporate success and more of an actual home. To Maple Ridge? Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. Possibly, Alexander acknowledged. It's a beautiful area, still within commuting distance of the city for board meetings and foundation work, but removed from the constant demands of urban life. Margaret studied him, her eyes thoughtful. That's a significant change, Alexander. Are you sure it's what you want? I've been sure of very little in my life until recently, he admitted. But I know I don't want to return to the person I was before, isolated, work-obsessed, measuring success in acquisitions and profit margins. And the alternative? Margaret asked softly. Alexander met her gaze directly. A life with more balance, more meaning, more connection. The word hung between them, laden with implication. In their year together, they had carefully navigated the evolution of their relationship, mindful of Margaret's ongoing grief and Alexander's profound life changes. They had never explicitly discussed a shared future, though the possibility had begun to hover unspoken in their interactions. Connection is important, Margaret agreed, her voice gentle. But so is independence. We've both been through significant transformations this past year. Are you sure you're not rushing into another major change? Alexander appreciated her caution, her unwillingness to be swept along by impulse. It was one of the many qualities he had come to admire in her. I've given it considerable thought, he assured her. This isn't a reaction or an escape. It's a deliberate choice about the kind of life I want going forward. Margaret nodded, accepting this. Then I'd love to see this old library tomorrow. They finished packing for their hike in comfortable silence, each contemplating the conversation and its implications. As they prepared to leave, Margaret paused at the door, turning to Alexander with an expression of quiet determination. I want you to know something, she said. I've been thinking about changes too. Alexander waited, giving her space to continue. This house, Margaret gestured around them. It's been both a comfort and a kind of anchor holding me to the past. I've been considering whether it's time to let it go, to find somewhere that doesn't carry quite so many memories. That's a big step, Alexander observed. Are you ready for it? Margaret considered this. I think I am. Robert will always be part of me, but I don't need these specific walls to remember him. And I'm discovering that there's more room in my heart than I realized. Room for new memories, new experiences. She met his eyes. New love. It was the first time either of them had explicitly used that word to describe what had grown between them. Alexander felt its impact like a physical sensation, a tightening in his chest, a quickening of his pulse. I was beginning to wonder if that word was off limits, he said, trying to keep his tone light despite the emotion behind it. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face with a brightness that still caught Alexander by surprise. Not off limits, she corrected, just waiting for the right moment. And this is that moment? Alexander asked, hardly daring to believe it. Standing in the doorway on our way to a hike, discussing real estate? Margaret laughed softly. It's not very romantic, is it? But yes, I think it is the right moment. Because it's honest, and it's real, and it's part of the lives we're actually living, not some fantasy version of a second chance. Alexander reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. I love you, Margaret Walsh, he said simply. Not despite your grief or your history, but including all of it. It's part of who you are, and who you are is extraordinary. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the devastating tears of grief he had witnessed in the early days of their acquaintance. These were different, complex, emotional, but not altogether unhappy. I love you too, she replied, and that doesn't diminish what I had with Robert. It's not a replacement or a substitute. It's something new, something I never expected to find again. Alexander understood completely. His love for Margaret wasn't a solution to his existential crisis or an escape from his corporate life. It was something separate and precious, a connection that had helped him see himself more clearly, that had given him the courage to make changes he'd been contemplating for years. They stepped outside into the June sunshine, hand in hand, ready for their hike and whatever lay beyond. The bus that had brought them together was long gone, its route completed and forgotten. But the journey it had started continued, taking them places neither could have imagined on that rainy morning a year ago when a heartbroken widow had sat down beside a silent CEO, both of them searching for something they couldn't name. What they had found was not a fairy tale ending but something better, a genuine beginning built on shared understanding, mutual respect, and the quiet courage it takes to embrace life after loss. Together they walked toward the future, carrying their past experiences not as burdens but as the essential foundations of who they had become. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Just click on the screen.